My husband and I gave 9 years of our lives trying to have a baby, but just one call from his mother turned our dream into ashes. I still remember the smell of fresh coffee and new paint in our bedroom, which we had just finished. James was sticking the last stars on the nursery ceiling. It wasn't just a room. It was our 10-year plan, compressed into 4 walls. We were both on the verge of 40, and after 9 years of failed attempts, invasive procedures, and IVF clinic bills, we finally got what we went through all that hell for. A positive test. The IVF worked. We were waiting for our first ultrasound in 2 weeks, and living in this bubble of absolute fragile happiness. We bought the first tiny onesie, and I kept it hidden in a drawer, sometimes just taking it out to cry with joy. These were our last savings invested in this hope, in this future, and now it was real. Everything collapsed when his mother, Patricia, called. I was in the living room browsing baby furniture catalogs when I heard James's voice change. He always talks to his mother calmly, even when she tries to manipulate him, but this time was different. I only caught fragments, but they sounded like gunshots. Yes, Mom, I understand. No, she doesn't know. Bad? How bad? When he walked into the room, his face was an ashen gray. Not just upset, but that color you get when you've just learned news that will forever divide your life into before and after. He sat heavily on the sofa, as if he had suddenly gained 100 pounds. "It's Miles," he said, his voice dry and lifeless. Miles is his younger brother. He's 30, and he's always been trouble. Not a bad guy, just irresponsible. He lived on welfare, changed jobs every few months, and was constantly getting into minor scrapes. We saw him once every 6 months at Thanksgiving, and that was enough. He was always a source of worry for Patricia, but not for us. We lived our own lives. What's wrong with him, James? Did he break something or owe someone money again? I asked, trying not to sound too sharp, but I was irritated. Any interference in our lives from his family right now felt cruel. He looked me straight in the eyes, and I saw something there that made me flinch. Not anger, not sadness, but a kind of primal fear. "He's in the hospital, Sarah. He has. He's seriously ill. Something with his kidneys, they're failing. He needs immediate constant care and very, very expensive treatment. Specialized. Mom says they have no money. None. And his insurance. It only covers the bare minimum." She asked if we could. He couldn't finish. He just stared at me, and I stared at him. In the dim light from the window, I could see the light from the stars he had just stuck on the ceiling reflected in his eyes. Stars for our baby. And then it hit me. "James," my voice trembled. "What does very expensive treatment mean? How expensive?" He swallowed. "Mom said that to bring him home and hire 2 qualified nurses to give him round-the-clock care, and buy the necessary equipment for the first little while. It will cost about $150,000 immediately, and then the monthly expenses will be astronomical. We would have to give up our savings, Sarah. All of it. The ones we have left after the IVF." I felt my body grow cold, starting from my extremities and moving toward my heart. Not savings, our safety net. Not just money, our last money, which we had saved for years, which was our only chance for a second child, if the first embryo didn't take, or if we wanted a little brother or sister. This was the money we had won back from fate. And now Miles's family, who never cared about our well-being, had suddenly come for it. I stood up, walked over to the drawer, took out the little onesie, and tightly gripped it in my hand. "He can't live here, James. We don't have the space, and I'm pregnant. I can't be caring for a critically ill person and be pregnant. It's impossible. And that money. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what you are asking me to give up?" He lowered his head and whispered, "He is my brother, Sarah. He is dying." My own brother? Of course I wouldn't hesitate. But Miles? The guy who always avoided us, who didn't even send us a Christmas card. Give up our baby, our second chance, for a person who ruined his own life? This wasn't just a waste of money, it was a moral bargain. And our future was at stake. "I know he's your brother," I said, feeling tears sting my eyes. "But that money is our backup embryo in the cryobank, James. It's our last straw. Do you want us to choose his life, at the cost of perhaps the only chance we have left to be parents?" His silence was the answer. My husband, the kindest and most decent man I knew, now stood before me, and his eyes screamed, "Yes, I choose him." I placed the onesie back on the dresser, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "Then we have a problem, James. A very big problem that we have to solve this month while Miles is in the hospital. Because if you choose him, I'm not sure I can stay." The air in our house turned cold instantly, heavier than any winter freeze. James didn't argue back, which somehow was worse than any fight. He just stood there, shoulders slumped, looking like a little boy who had been caught stealing. It was Sunday, and that meant we had exactly 4 weeks, 1 month, before Miles was scheduled to be discharged from the initial stabilization phase at the hospital. 4 weeks to decide if our decade-long dream of a family was worth less than his brother's life. I spent the next 3 days avoiding him. We slept in the same bed, but there was a canyon between us. We spoke only in clipped, necessary sentences. "Did you pay the electric bill? I need milk." The silence screamed louder than any accusation. I kept thinking about what he said. "He is my brother, Sarah. He is dying." I knew that was the truth of it for James. He was wired to be the good son, the good sibling, the reliable one who always paid the emotional and financial debt for his dysfunctional family. That's one of the things I loved about him, ironically. His deep, unwavering sense of duty. But duty stops when it requires sacrificing your entire future. On Wednesday, I had my first prenatal appointment. I went alone. I told James the first was going to the grocery store. I couldn't bear the thought of him sitting next to me watching the monitor while we were in this limbo. Seeing that tiny, flickering heartbeat on the screen was supposed to be the moment we truly bonded over this pregnancy. The moment it became real for both of us. Instead, I saw it, and the wave of love and protectiveness that hit me was immense, but it was immediately followed by a chilling realization. This life is mine, this future is mine, and I won't let anyone take it. Not even James, and certainly not Miles. The doctor, Dr. Chun, was all smiles. She told me everything looked perfect. When she asked about my husband, I just mumbled something about him being stuck at work. I looked at the image she printed out, a fuzzy black and white snapshot of our hope, and tucked it deep into my wallet. It felt too precious, too vulnerable, to bring into the toxic atmosphere of our home. When I got back, James was on the phone in the kitchen. I stopped dead in the hallway. He wasn't talking to his mother this time. He was talking to Ethan, Miles's doctor. He was taking notes, scribbling furiously on the back of an old receipt. "So the dialysis schedule is 3 times a week? And the initial prognosis is terminal without a transplant, correct? And what are the chances of him being approved for a transplant given his history?" I leaned against the wall, listening. James was doing his homework. He wasn't just blindly agreeing with his manipulative mother. He was investigating. And the answers he was getting were brutal. I heard Ethan mention the cost again, confirming the $150,000 upfront for specialized in-home care, and the subsequent indefinite, high-cost monthly expenses. The doctor also brought up Miles's lifestyle factors, which was a polite way of saying his past habits made him a terrible candidate for a kidney transplant, even if a donor was found. Essentially, we would be emptying our entire life savings into a situation with a statistically very low chance of long-term success. We weren't buying a cure. We were buying maybe 6 months, perhaps a year, of slightly better comfort. James hung up the phone and saw me standing there. He didn't flinch. He just looked exhausted. "You know what the hard part is, Sarah?" he said, folding the receipt with the doctor's notes. "It's not the money. The money hurts, yeah, it kills me that we'd lose our chance at another kid. But I can't shake the feeling that if I don't do this, if I let him die when I have the means to stop it, I won't be able to live with myself. I will never look you or our child in the eye without seeing my dead brother in the corner of the room." I walked closer, my anger finally dissolving into a cold, hard resolve. "And what about me, James? You think you'll be able to look me in the eye when I'm 45 and we're trying to scrimp together another $100,000 for a last-ditch IVF attempt? When I'm mourning the child we could have had, the sibling we could have given to the one I'm carrying. You're choosing a guilt that you might feel over a guarantee of ruin for our family." He ran a hand over his face. "I'm not asking you to take care of him, Sarah. I'm asking you to let me use our money to pay for the care. I will handle everything. I'll quit my job and find something remote. I'll hire the nurses, I'll manage the schedule. You won't have to see him. That was the line that crossed everything. Quit your job. James, you're the main earner. You want to take away our savings and compromise our steady income. All while I'm pregnant? My voice was low, deadly. And what happens when the money runs out in 6 months? Who pays the mortgage? Who pays for the baby we already have on the way? He looked at the floor. We'll figure it out. No, James, I said, my grip tightening on my handbag containing the sonogram image. We won't. I'm telling you this now while we still have time to make a real choice. You choose Miles, you choose the money, and you choose the debt of guilt that your mother put on you. But you don't choose us. If that money leaves our account this month, then when Miles comes home I won't be here. I will take what's necessary for the baby and me, and I will go. You can't have both. The threat was out there, sharp and undeniable. It hung between us, replacing the scent of new paint with the stale smell of impossible choices. He looked up, his face registering the full weight of my ultimatum. He knew I wasn't bluffing. But what he didn't know was that while I was fighting for my baby and my future, I had already started doing my own investigations into Miles's situation, and what I found out next week would change the dynamic completely, pulling a dark curtain back on a secret his family had kept for years. The ultimatum I gave James didn't break him. It galvanized him into a defensive fury I'd never seen before. He wasn't yelling. His anger was a cold, precise chisel. He treated the house like a war zone, moving around me with calculated distance. My threat, that if he spent the $150,000 I would leave, had put a timeline on his guilt. He had to save his brother and save his marriage within the same 4 weeks, and that impossible tension was manifesting as silent hostility. A week passed, marking the halfway point of Miles's hospital stay. The initial shock had worn off, and now we were deep in the grinding reality of financial panic and moral wrestling. I spent my days contacting financial advisors and lawyers, trying to find some loophole, some insurance option, anything that wasn't our last-ditch effort at having a second child. I found nothing. Miles's case was clear-cut, chronic self-inflicted damage over years, resulting in a crisis requiring specialized, non-covered care. James, meanwhile, was fighting his own battle, but his was against me and the clock. He started sleeping in the guest room, claiming he needed to be fresh for work, even though he was barely sleeping at all, judging by the dark circles under his eyes. One evening I came home from work and found a sheaf of papers spread across the kitchen table. They were detailed printouts of payment plans, loan applications, and government assistance forms, all highlighted and annotated in James's frantic handwriting. Picked one up. It was an application to refinance our mortgage. He was trying to pull equity out of the house, our house, the one we bought together, to cover the medical costs without touching the savings account. Are you serious, James? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, yet it felt like a shout in the silent house. He slammed the refrigerator door shut. I'm trying to find a compromise, Sarah. I'm trying to keep my brother alive and keep you here. If we refinance, we can get that $150,000 without touching the cryobank fund. We pay a higher monthly mortgage, yes, but we keep the security. We keep the possibility of another baby. A possibility we couldn't afford anyway, James. I threw the paper back on the table. You're adding $700 to our monthly payment. Do you realize what kind of stress that puts on a family about to have a newborn? We can't survive that kind of debt. Not when we were already scraping by after the first round of IVF. You are still crippling our future, just in a different way. He took a step towards me, and this was the hardest conflict we'd ever had. It's my family, Sarah. I know you hate Miles, I know you think he's a useless drain, but he is still my blood. I can't let him die in a government facility when I have the means to give him dignity in his last months. And honestly, I don't understand why this is such a fight for you. We have one healthy baby on the way. Isn't that enough for you? Why does the possibility of a second child outweigh the certainty of saving my brother? That question. Isn't that enough for you? Cut deeper than anything else. It implied I was greedy, selfish, or somehow ungrateful for the miracle growing inside me. It's not about greed, James. It's about being used. It's about the decade we spent building this security, this foundation, only to have your mother wave her hand and demand we dismantle it for a man who never lifted a finger for himself. And don't you dare imply I'm not grateful for this baby. I'm protecting this baby and our future with every fiber of my being. This refinance idea is stupid and short-sighted, and it just delays the inevitable financial collapse. The pressure was mounting not just from the money but from Patricia. She wasn't just asking James for money. She was making emotional house calls. She showed up unannounced on Friday, claiming she brought casseroles. I knew she was there to pressure James. She sat in our living room, the one we just painted, and wept, describing Miles's condition in agonizing detail, her voice dripping with guilt. James, honey, he asks for you. He keeps saying, I wish James was here. Your poor brother is fading. He doesn't have much time left. We just need to bring him home. We just need that startup fund. She kept glancing at me, her eyes saying, you are the obstacle. You are the selfish one. I stayed quiet, refusing to engage, but I watched James. He looked tormented. He was tearing himself apart between his wife, his unborn child, and his dying brother. Later that night, I went through the documents on the table again, specifically the ones related to Miles's medical history. James had carelessly left a sealed envelope from Miles's previous primary care physician, dated 3 years ago. It was a referral letter. My heart pounded. I shouldn't have opened it, but the secrecy and manipulation had reached a breaking point. I carefully slit the envelope open. Inside was a formal letter stating that Miles was diagnosed with chronic kidney disease, stage 4, and needed immediate, serious lifestyle changes and ongoing medical management to prevent catastrophic failure. The letter was a dire warning, essentially stating that he needed help 3 years ago. It wasn't a sudden illness. It was a crisis that had been building for years, a crisis James's mother knew about and never told us. She had watched him neglect his health for years and was only calling us now, at the point of no return, when the cost was astronomically high. This wasn't just Miles dying. This was calculated deception. They waited until we were financially and emotionally vulnerable, right after the expensive IVF and while I was pregnant, to drop this bomb. I stood there, the letter shaking in my hand. This wasn't just about saving our money anymore. This was about a deliberate, years-long lie that his family had allowed to fester, and they expected us to pay the ultimate price for their negligence. I looked at the dark nursery down the hall. I looked at the closed guest room door. The moral dilemma had just been replaced by a much darker, much harder truth. I knew what I had to do next week. I had to confront James with this lie. The letter I found from Miles's doctor wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a weapon. It confirmed everything I suspected. This wasn't an unavoidable tragedy. It was a preventable collapse that Patricia and Miles had intentionally hidden until the last, most desperate moment. They had kept the secret for 3 years, fully aware of his stage 4 kidney failure, only reaching out when James, the good son, was their only viable source of a 6-figure rescue package. I spent the weekend analyzing the logistics. Miles's discharge date was looming, now only 2 weeks away. James had almost finalized the mortgage refinancing paperwork. He was pushing the compromise, trying to sell me on the idea that a higher mortgage was better than losing our savings. He was operating on the flawed premise that he was dealing with an emergency. I knew better. I was dealing with a fraud. I decided I couldn't just drop the letter on him. He was too emotionally fragile, too deep in his guilt-driven mission to save his brother. I had to approach it strategically, like dismantling a bomb. Monday morning, James was getting ready for work. He was quieter than usual, humming nervously as he tied his tie. He was clearly preparing for another difficult conversation, maybe another push for me to sign the refinance documents. James, I said, leaning against the doorframe of our bedroom, which felt miles away from the guest room where he was sleeping. I've been thinking about the refinance. I'm willing to sign. Under one condition. He stopped, his hand midair, holding the knot of his tie. His eyes, tired, desperate, flickered with a brief, agonizing hope. What is it, Sarah? Anything. I want full, transparent access to Miles's complete medical history, I stated calmly. Not just the recent reports but everything from the last 5 years. I want to hire a third-party medical consultant, not Dr. Chan, not Miles's current doctors, to independently review the files and confirm that this intensive, Costly home care plan is absolutely the only option before we sign away our future. If it's the only way, I'll sign the papers. He hesitated. The hope vanished, replaced by suspicion. Why? What difference does that make? The diagnosis is the diagnosis. He's dying, Sarah. Because $150,000 is too much money to spend on someone's life without due diligence, I replied, holding his gaze. We're not talking about a flat tire. We're talking about dissolving our financial safety net. If we are going to make this sacrifice, I need to be sure that the family hasn't misled you about anything. I need proof that the last 3 years of care weren't neglected, forcing this immediate, catastrophic expense on us. If everything is above board, I sign. If I find any evidence of concealment or negligence that led directly to this crisis, then we pull out entirely. The deal is off. Do you trust your family enough to agree to that? This was the moral dilemma shifted. Now James had to choose between blindly trusting his mother and brother, which would save face but cost us everything, or choosing radical transparency, which would expose the lie but potentially save our future. He stared at me for a long time. I watched the battle in his eyes. The guilt demanding immediate action versus the intellectual honesty demanding proof. I knew his mother would have already coached him to refuse any inspection, to cite privacy and dignity. But James at his core hated secrets. I need to talk to Mom and Miles, he finally said, his voice flat. But if you find anything at all that shows they lied to me, I'll be done. No more money. I can't live with being lied to and losing my marriage over it. The relief was physical. I knew the moment he agreed to the investigation, the truth would come out, and the refinance would never happen. The tension escalated immediately. James spent the next 2 days arguing furiously with Patricia on the phone. I heard snippets. No, Mom, she's right. We need the files. And why would they need privacy now? This isn't about shame. It's about $150,000. On Wednesday, the major plot twist dropped. James came home and he didn't go to the guest room. He came straight into the living room where I was trying to read, and he looked shattered. Miles, he refused, James said, barely able to speak. He absolutely refused to release his full medical file. He said it was humiliating and an invasion of privacy. He said he'd rather die in the hospital than let you paw through his records. But James's face told me more than his words. It wasn't Miles's pride talking. It was his fear of the truth coming out. And what did your mother say? I asked gently, knowing the answer. She called you a horrible, calculating bitch who was trying to kill her son. He whispered. She told me I had to choose right now. Either I sign the refinance papers today and agree to pay for Miles, or I lose them both. She hung up and sent a text. You choose your wife or your blood. He sank onto the sofa, defeated. She backed me into a corner, Sarah. She won. Feel sick. I feel like I'm losing everything. I sat next to him, placing my hand on his shoulder. No, James. She didn't win. She just confirmed the lie. I took the 3-year-old letter from my pocket and placed it silently in his hand. He read the letter, the one confirming Miles's stage 4 diagnosis 3 years ago, and his face went white. The finality of the deception hit him. It wasn't just about money. It was about betrayal. His own brother and mother had orchestrated this crisis, knowing full well we were vulnerable. They used me, he choked out. They knew about this for years. They waited until the perfect worst moment. The path was now clear, but the cost was still monumental. James had been completely betrayed, and now we had to act fast. We had 2 days before the hospital discharged Miles. The next step wasn't about saving money anymore. It was about protecting James from the destructive loyalty of his own family, and ensuring our unborn child was not born into debt and resentment. The culmination was coming. The moment James finished reading the 3-year-old letter, the air didn't feel heavy with tension anymore. It was electric with a kind of purified, righteous rage. His face, which had been a map of guilt and indecision for 2 weeks, hardened into something unrecognizable. The betrayal cut deeper than the financial threat. It wasn't Miles's illness that broke him. It was the manipulation by the 2 people he felt most obligated to protect. 3 years, James repeated, his voice barely a rasp. He crumpled the paper in his fist. They watched me go through hell with IVF, watched us drain our bank accounts for a baby, and they knew this was coming. They waited until we had nothing left, knowing that my guilt would force me to choose them. The hospital was giving Miles 48 hours until discharge. Patricia had stopped calling James directly. All communication was now happening through a series of venomous, manipulative texts sent to his work phone, framing him as a heartless failure of a son. She hadn't asked. She was demanding, using Miles's life as the currency. "We need a plan, James," I said, putting my hands on his shoulders. The time for anger was over. The time for action was now. We have to protect ourselves. We can't give them the money. But you can't just let your brother be abandoned either. Especially now that you know the truth. James looked at me, a clarity finally returning to his eyes. "No. I won't give them a cent of our savings or refinance our home. That ends now. But I am still his brother. I can't pay for the luxury care they demand, but I can ensure he gets necessary care." We spent the next day, the critical final day before discharge, not on the phone with lawyers but with hospital social workers. It was a brutal, pragmatic negotiation. We presented the case. Miles had been non-compliant with his care for years, his mother refused to provide long-term care, and we, the immediate family, were financially incapable of the $150,000 upfront cost for specialized in-home nurses. We showed them the 3-year-old letter, establishing a pattern of knowing neglect. The social worker, Brenda, was sympathetic but firm. If the family cannot provide the funds for the in-home care, and he is not a candidate for a transplant, the only remaining option is placement in a long-term care facility, a hospice, or a specialized chronic care wing. James looked at me, his eyes asking for approval. I nodded once. This was the compromise. Saving our future while ensuring Miles wasn't left to die on the street. It was the hardest, most clinical choice we had ever faced, choosing practical survival over impossible emotional ransom. James made the call to his mother that afternoon. I sat silently in the room, listening to the destruction of his family. "Mom, I am not giving you the $150,000. Sarah and I are not draining our savings or refinancing the house," James stated, his voice devoid of emotion, like a machine delivering a terrible truth. "We know about the stage 4 diagnosis 3 years ago. You lied to us. You waited for the worst possible moment to drop this on us, thinking I would choose guilt over my family." The explosion on the other end of the line was immediate and deafening. Patricia screamed, calling me every name imaginable. A calculating monster. A black widow who had stolen her son. But James cut through the noise. "Miles will not be discharged to your house. I have arranged for him to be admitted to the Willow Creek Chronic Care Facility. They specialize in palliative care and permanent dialysis. His basic medical needs will be covered by his minimal insurance, and I will personally pay a small monthly supplement for his comfort items and incidental expenses, no more than a few $100s a month. This is the only support you will get. He will have medical care. He will not die alone. But he will not ruin the life I built with my wife." Patricia's response was the final act of malice. "If you do this, James, you are dead to me. Miles is dead to you. You will never see me or him again. You chose that woman over your blood." James simply hung up. He didn't look triumphant, only completely empty. In less than a month, he had lost his brother and his mother, not to death, but to their own toxicity and deceit. 2 days later, Miles was transferred to Willow Creek. James didn't go. I encouraged him to, but he said, "I already said goodbye 3 years ago, Sarah. I just didn't know it." The $150,000 remained untouched in our account. The baby was still safe. We were safe. A few days after the transfer, I found the sonogram picture, the one I had hidden, sitting on the kitchen counter, next to James's half-empty coffee mug. He had found it. He walked into the room and for the first time in a month he held me. Not passionately, but with a deep, shaky gratitude. "Thank you for holding the line, Sarah," he whispered into my hair. "Thank you for fighting for us." We had won the financial war, but the victory tasted like ash. We were alone now, just the two of us, waiting for our baby, cut off completely from James's family. We had our second chance, the money for the cryobank was still there, but the emotional cost was devastating. We saved our future, but we destroyed a past. I often stare at the nursery ceiling now, looking at the tiny plastic stars James put up. I wonder if the peace and quiet of our home, now free from the demands of his family, is truly worth the permanent gaping hole they left. We are safe, we are pregnant, and we are together, but every silent night I am left with a terrifying question. When we finally hold our baby, will James ever truly forgive himself for the life he had to save by letting go of his blood?